Hello, innovators. I'm Todd Weyandt, and welcome to the Bridging the Gap podcast presented by Great Tech Group, where we model the future of construction innovation and the digital transformation of this great industry. This episode is part of Prefab Unfiltered, recorded live at Advancing Prefabrication. One of the themes that kept coming up throughout this conference is that prefabrication is no longer a technology problem. The tools are here. The platforms are here. The capability is here. The real challenge now is people, process, risk, and coordination. And that's exactly what we're digging into in today's conversation. I'm joined by Emily Mills Marineau, who brings a unique perspective to the prefabrication conversation. Before entering construction, she built her career in M&A at Apple. She was later pulled into the world of industrialized construction and has now spent multiple chapters helping rethink how projects are delivered, financed, and coordinated. This is a thoughtful, candid conversation about how prefabrication moves from curiosity to confidence. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Bridging the Gap podcast presented by Great Tech Group. We are recording live at Advancing Prefab here in Dallas. And welcome to the show, Emily. Thanks for taking the time to sit down and talk with us today.
Likewise, Todd. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I always like to start with your origin story. How'd you get into the construction industry to begin with?
I had no intention of ending up in the construction industry. I was happily at Apple buying companies. I did M&A most of my career. And so was doing acquisitions there when I got pulled out of Apple by a former business school professor of mine, a guy named Michael Marks, who at this point is most famous in this space for having founded Katerra. Katerra obviously came out of the gates in 2016 timeframe to make a big splash in industrialized construction.
Yeah. So what was the draw of jumping in and coming into construction?
Like Michael had always told me, he said, when you kind of want to work for a company that's really fast growing, you come join me. I think when I took a step back and thought about it, what was compelling enough about leaving Apple to go take a leap of faith into a space that, frankly, at the time, I knew nothing about. I thought a lot about, maybe it was an Apple perspective, the user experience, right? The built world is something that is almost, as ubiquitous, perhaps more ubiquitous than the technology that we hold in our hands every day. I asked myself a really dumb question. Would you rather have a house or an iPhone? At the end of the day, I want to have a house. If I don't have a house, I'd rather have an iPhone. So those two things, to me, were sort of on par in terms of the way that people move through their lives. And if there was a way to influence people's access to that in some way, then that was exciting.
Yeah. So as you think about the last decade, then what are some lessons learned from that experience? What's kept you in for the...
Yeah. Why am I in this for round three? Look, I think at the end of the day, Michael was right. There were a lot of things that Katerra got wrong, but the opportunity is still there and the need is still there and the ability to have an impact on both lives, but on, economic outcomes for the tremendous population of the world that works in and experiences the built environment is the thing that keeps me going. I really think we have an opportunity to do better. And I also think the industry gets a little bit of a bad rap, right? There's a lot that's said about, this is a lagging industry with not enough technology and the productivity is declining and it's inefficient and this, that, and the other. But I actually think the industry is doing really darn well with the cards that they've been handed over the years. And so anything that we can do to help enable the folks that are doing really great work, to put homes and offices and airports and things like that on the ground, I think is worth doing.
Yeah. Regular listeners will know that I'm a broken record with this, but I 100% agree with you. I push back a lot that the construction industry doesn't, embrace innovation and the technology. It is here in this space. Look around at this conference. There's a bunch of tech happening. There's the rapid adoption over the last couple of years is pretty mind blowing and would, kind of freak a lot of other industries out. The tech is here in this space. I think where we fall short for construction is we don't do a good job of marketing that and telling that story to the people outside of the industry, or even frankly to ourselves for that matter.
Fair. And I actually think that with lots of technology, again, this is maybe my Apple bias, but technology is not a technology problem. The technology is there and the technology is good. It's a people problem, right? How do you convince people how do you help people, not convince people, how do you help people easily adopt technology in a way that makes their lives better rather than worse out of the gates?
Yeah.
Right. We've all opened up a new tool, software, this, that, or the other. And been like, I have absolutely no idea what to use with this. I'm going to go back to my Excel spreadsheet, whatever, what have you.
Right.
Right. But that's a people problem, not a tech.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the common pitfalls that people fall into with that people problem is that they use the same messaging to every single stakeholder. And in construction, it's so disparate that you can't use that, because what a GC cares about is going to be very different than the person actually on the job site, the trade building it, is going to be very different than the owner perspective. You have to be able to pivot and talk the simplicity of it to the persona that you're going after there.
Well, in a perfect world, what you want to do is make the technology go away and solve the problem, right? You make the technology not go away. Go away is not the right phrasing, but disappear into the background, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, and Apple was brilliant.
It's really good at that.
Right.
I don't claim to be the next, Steve Jobs, but hopefully there are some lessons learned that we can apply.
Yeah, for sure.
How do I think about that?
For sure. So when bringing it to advancing prefab here, you've been leading some classes. What are the topics? How has that been going?
Yeah, I think, look, at all these things, you kind of hear the things that are most interesting to you, and those are the things that resonate. But one of the things that we at Juno have been thinking a lot about and working on a lot is this sort of process and people problem. We want to be known as the orchestration, the coordination layer. And so what I've heard a lot that I find really encouraging is that that's come up in conversation several times, right? How do we document our lessons learned? How do we bring them from project to project? How do we, it's one thing, this conference talks a lot about, like, get everybody involved early, right? Bring people to the table, bring us in early in our projects. Well, that's great, but somebody said earlier, like, if you can't have everybody in the driver's seat, right? If you brought them all to the front of the bus, then you have a different problem, right? And so what I'm hearing a lot people thinking about is, how do we then adopt our processes and manage our projects a little bit differently to enable the prefabrication, the technology to work. So that's really encouraging, because that's exactly the space that we want to play. So I'm excited to hear that.
Yeah. Any suggestions on how to think through that well, so that, you don't have the problem of everybody in the driver's seat, but it's the right people at the right time?
Yeah, I mean, we've stood up a business as an owner's rep doing exactly that. So I think, without sort of giving away the secret sauce, I think so much of it is understanding what problem is that you're solving, what you're solving for, and what success looks like. Is it always cost? Is it first cost? Is it risk? Is it certainty? What are we actually trying to achieve, and what are we trying to deliver with this project or with this portion of the project, and backing into it from there?
Yeah. So when a lot of people think about the owner perspective, the cliche of the better, faster. Yeah. So is it really that simple, or is there kind of some undercurrents at play that people don't necessarily see and think about?
I wish I could tell you now, but prior to coming to this conference, I sort of posted one of my the title to the talk that I was assigned on LinkedIn, and said, hey, what do you guys think about this? Is it really as simple as better, faster, cheaper? And the resounding answer, at least from the internet, at least, was yes. I think, though, at the end of the day, what ownership cares about is risk-adjusted returns, right? And so that's kind of a wonky way of saying, maybe, that it's not just cost, it's cost and risk. And so maybe, I think one of the places that prefab in general goes to die, unfortunately, is where it's cost parity, or maybe even a little bit more expensive, but the perceived risk is that much higher. So then how can we address the perceived risk in trying something new and different, so that the cost piece becomes a little bit more comparable?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. So how do you balance the desire for pushing innovation and trying new things, and being kind of on the, maybe not necessarily the bleeding edge, but maybe that step behind. With that risk management piece of the equation.
I mean, I think that's exactly it, right? Is that you can't push innovation if you don't manage the risk piece of it. And so, I would rather innovation pull the industry. I would rather be pulled by our customers, by ownership into how can we do things, their question, how can we do things better, faster, cheaper? The desire to do that is what's going to drive innovation, and the ability to deliver that in a risk-adjusted way is what I think is going to get it through the gates. And I think that's working with, that is really a stakeholder coordination challenge, right? Do we have the insurance on board? Do we have the lender on board? Have we brought everybody along? Do we bring the right people to the table at the right time? What did we do as far as design? How far did we push the drawings before we got it out to bid? Did everybody's scopes right? Do we have the right group with the right subs, the right contractor on this project, not just the one you like the best?
Yeah. So that brings up like the ecosystem that comes along with it. How do you think through developing that ecosystem of partners to have your kind of your trusted people that you go to, that how they're going to work, their seat on the bus, their rhythm and everything, to be able to deliver that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great place to find those kinds of partners. I think one of the things that I struggle with these types of shows is that you're often preaching to the choir, right? The people that show up here are the ones that already care.
Right.
But for us, from a vendor and from a trade partner perspective, the people that are showing up at this are asking the right questions, right? So I think that's a big part of it. And then, it's construction still a local business. You got to get in there. You got to know your market. And I think you can tell pretty quickly who is willing when you ask for somebody to provide you a conceptual estimate, maybe in a different template, a different format than they're used to, on a slightly different scope. You figure out really quickly,
yeah,
who's going to send you the thing they've always sent you, and who's interested in playing ball.
Yeah. No, makes sense. So going back to the owners kind of pulling it through the innovation thing, I think that's been an interesting trend line to follow over the last couple of years. Is, I was talking about on another conversation a little bit ago, is 5 years ago when we started coming to this conference, we need to get the owners' attention and we need to get them bought in on it. I don't think that's the conversation that's happening now. Owners are bought in on prefab, they get it. That awareness factor is very much there. Now it's how do the owners kind of own that and really pull it. How have you seen that evolution over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, for better and for worse, I would describe almost every owner out there right now as prefab curious, right? What they've heard is that it has the potential, when executed correctly, to reduce cost, increase certainty, and drive timelines. And so I think it's now incumbent on us as an industry to A, demonstrate that we can work together and deliver that, and B, to start documenting and telling those stories, right? I think the lack of successful case studies, not because the success stories aren't out there, but because they haven't been documented and shared widely, of, sometimes they're even micro, of how this particular component installed, sort of managed in this way. I'm trying to think of a good example here, but, actually drove some small, maybe it was a $10, $15, $20, $30,000 savings in a particular line item of your budget, but like over time, fewer of those add up.
Right. Yeah. It goes back to what we're saying at the beginning of kind of that marketing problem of not being able to tell the stories clearly. So the question is, that's been frustrating me for years, is like, why? Why do we stop and not communicate that well? Any thoughts here?
It's something we've been wrestling with as a business right now a lot, which is to say, like, we want to deliver projects, and we need to be able to tell people that we're going to deliver their projects on time and on budget. Okay, so what does that mean? If we made a conscious decision somewhere along the way that we were actually going to slow down this part of our process to go back and make a design change that we know is going to save us money down the line, well, we're on budget, so that's why we did it. But are we on schedule? Right? And so I think it's hard to... I think it's really hard to measure outcomes where the baseline is constantly moving, right? We start our project that's coming out of the ground in Florida next month is now 296 units. It started as 400. So like when I look back and look at how the numbers and the pro forma has evolved, the returns are there, but the budget number is different, right? And so I just think, I think the nature of development is such that it's really, really hard to sort of put a stake in the ground and say, this is what we're measuring against. That makes it really hard to then deliver quantifiable outcomes. But I think we need to come up with a solution to that. And we're thinking a lot about it right now. And we're actually asking a lot of developers, how do you measure success? From what point, on against what stick are we going to be measured?
Yeah.
And are you measuring yourselves?
Yeah. Makes sense. I think another, unique hurdle in terms of measuring it too is that especially when you're starting on the prefab journey, is you might not see those savings in that first project. Probably was long. You're playing a long game, and so if you're measuring in just a kind of a point in time, you may see worse results. But if you measure over the long term, that's when you see all that dramatic cost curve start to bend.
I firmly believe that the first project can't be worse. We had that experience. Juno had a predecessor company, and the first project that we delivered exceeded on so many metrics, but from cost and schedule, it was behind. So that made it really hard to get project 2 going. So I'm a big believer that no matter, whatever project 1 looks like, it cannot lose money, right? And it ideally cannot be worse. And so you're starting from a point of compare, it has to be at least as good as conventional construction or it's never going to get prefabbed. And then it can only improve from there. I'm a big, I know that real estate finance works the way that real estate finance works and projects are financed and teams are assembled on a project by project basis. I'm a big believer that if anybody wanted to truly prove out a prefabricated productized thesis using a modular or a kit of parts like we had in that company, you need to commit to doing, I don't know if it's 3 or 5 or 10, but you need to commit to doing more than one in the same location with more or less the same team, because those lessons learned and that continuity of experience going from project to project is super important. And it's what gets lost in all these jobs.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. So then it's the, start small, scale up. But in construction, you have the battle when we're talking prefab of the standardization component versus in a construction site, things change and you have to be able to have that flexibility to be customizable. How do you think through that of that kind of continuum of standardization versus customization?
Versus flexibility. My co-founder would tell you it comes down to your grid. And particularly when you're thinking about prefabricated structural systems, how do you break it down? And so this is probably more broadly applicable as I think it through out loud. It comes down to that lowest common denominator. What is the smallest unit of standardization that you can repeat the most number of times? And so if you can get something that is modular, not in the volumetric sense, but in the sort of system sense, then you can build off that.
No. Interesting. Makes sense. Are there certain lines where you're like, this doesn't make sense for prefab and you have that kind of well documented, so you'll skip on that job?
I don't think it's as universal as that. I wish it was that easy, right? But I actually think you have to look at the project, at the jurisdiction, at the product, and figure out what makes sense. I was just talking with Ricardo from Bath Systems, and we were talking about specific union environments where the pricing might be great on his bath pod, but if it is being delivered into a union environment where the trade pricing from the person that's going to do the connections isn't going to give you the benefit of installing that, it's not the right thing for the project, and you shouldn't do it. So I'm a big believer in bath pods. And they're not a universal solution.
Yeah.
Right.
So how do you think through the measurement of success when variables are changing constantly between different projects?
It's one of the things where I wish I had a better answer. Come back to me in a couple of months. It's something we're really trying to think about. And where we're looking or where we're leaning is that we're big believers in this go slow to go fast model, right? So spend a little bit more time in pre-development, coordinating, planning, so that when you get into the field where your decisions get expensive or where your delays get expensive, that's where you can go fast. And so we're starting to wonder if the right way to measure is not total project duration, but is like construction timelines, or obviously returns are a generalized metric like multiples. So looking more at that.
So more so like breaking the big project down into smaller kind of sprints, so to speak.
And also zooming up to a point. So it's like, all right, maybe I can't, maybe the budget went from, X to Y, and that was a good thing. But if at the same time the rents went from A to Z, maybe my returns went up at the same time that my costs went up. Right. And so there are some metrics, I think, where you have to zoom out and look at it more holistically, and some metrics like speed of timeline where you want to zoom in and focus on, things.
So if you're zooming out on the overall kind of life cycle of the building itself, how do you start building that sense of momentum of, hey, this project was a success if you're looking over a years and years worth of timeline?
You have to do a lot of projects.
Yeah.
I would also say, actually, I think when it comes to zooming out, taking a step, a click back in the conversation, operational efficiency is really important. I think too many people look at construction cost as like your point in time. This is the right up until stabilization. I'm speaking from the multifamily perspective right now, but they look at, what's it going to cost me to get it built, get it leased. I think particularly for the developers who are in it for the long haul, but is it going to, how do you start to think about it might cost a little more upfront, but it's going to save me money in insurance. And that's a recurring cost that I'm not going to incur, that I'm going to incur less of year after year after year after year. So maybe we haven't zoomed out enough to say that, okay, some of these metrics or some of these technologies are actually going to help us juice the overall project economics. Even if they look like a step backwards from construction.
Yeah. Interesting. So,
tough one.
I like to think through the misconceptions that are out there in the industry. What do you see as a common misconception that people have about the owner's expectations?
I think for a second before I say this, but I do think the misperception that it just is cheaper. I think that is a misconception. I think that it is, I think owners will tolerate within some small margin of error, on par or more expensive with the certainty. This goes back to that idea of risk-adjusted return. So how can we, as an industry, get better at saying we're going to deliver exactly what we said we were going to deliver when we said we were going to deliver it, so that we know that the numbers that we're putting in front of people are accurate and we can be held accountable to it.
Yeah, makes sense. Any big takeaways from the conference so far?
This lessons learned database. The industry needs this. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah.
It's something that keeps coming up in these conversations. Everybody keeps saying, like, how do we document? How do we build this repository of our lessons learned so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel on every single project?
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the cool things about this conference in particular, is that people are willing to share their lessons learned and share the good, the bad, the ugly of, hey, this totally failed on a project, but this is what we learned from it and how we adjust it, and then we got it fixed. And so that learnings, you come to conferences like this in order to have that database.
And then the trick becomes, like, how do we document those and make those more widely available across an industry that still remains very fragmented?
Right. It's a hard come back to that. And my last question, you might you might have an answer for that one. Preview of it. So any conversation that we're not having at this conference or in the industry that we should be?
That's a great question. I would be really curious to understand from folks what people are actually seeing on the labor side, right? The whole, overarching, like the whole drive behind advancing prefabrication is that ultimately we are hitting up against a labor shortage, and that labor shortage, particularly when it comes to skilled trades, is only going to get worse over time.
Mm.
One of the things that outside of this conference, I hear that question a lot. And so what I'm really curious about from folks in your audience, from people here, is like, how is that actually playing out in real life?
Yeah.
I haven't, it's almost like something we've taken for granted, right? The statistics are there. 9 out of 10 construction job openings remain unfilled. 60% of the labor force is, is retiring in the next few years. Like the immigration, dynamics are challenging for this industry. Like, but what does that actually mean? And how is it showing up today? How are we expecting it to show up tomorrow? And what are we doing about it?
Yeah. Yeah. And then the technology element that gets thrown on, all the retirements happening, but do you need as many, depending on what tech comes into the space, or, the whole AI question then comes into place? There's a lot of dynamics. It's a complicated issue for sure. Yeah. So a couple rapid fire questions as we start to wrap up. What is the phrase modeling the future? What does that mean and look like to you?
It's funny, with Mike and my sort of industry hat on, I go into BIM and coordination and sort of advanced level of detail. But then as I take a step back and think about, because you just brought up AI, right? I think shifting our understanding in our own brains, like the actual human intelligence versions of how the world should, I think about, right? Like how do we build a real world model for what we think can be done on paper?
I like it. What does innovation mean?
Innovation means that not falling back, continuing to fall back on the way you did it yesterday. Always asking why.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Not allowing yourself to be this is the way we've always done it mentality.
I hope I never say that.
Yeah, me too. How do people connect with you and learn more?
Our website is www.juno.co, and I'm Emily at juno.co.
Awesome. And last question for you. If I could give you all construction power, you could snap your fingers and innovate one thing, what would you pick to innovate?
Man, that's a good question. I want all the contingency out of these jobs. I want us to get to a point of certainty so that all the contingency can come out of these projects. Because that money is, that's free money.
Yeah, that's a good one. I was thinking you might go back to the lessons learned database. Got to snap it. Both are great.
Yeah. There's some interesting technology out there that could help us with all this, right?
Yeah. Emily, thanks so much for taking the time and joining the show today.
Thanks for having me.
And now it's time for my Todd takes from this episode. First take. Owners do not want cheaper. They want certainty. One of the strongest themes in this conversation is that prefabrication is not primarily about cost reduction. It's about risk-adjusted return. Owners are not looking for the lowest numbers. They are looking for predictability, schedule certainty, quality control, and confidence that a project will not derail. In modular construction and prefabrication, the real value often shows up in reduced variability, fewer surprises, and stronger coordination across the project lifecycle. If we continue positioning prefab as cheaper, we miss the point. The value is certainty. Second take. The first prefab project cannot fail. For many organizations, the first prefabrication project sets the tone for years to come. If that first modular or offsite construction effort struggles, the internal narrative becomes, we tried prefab and it did not work. That reputational risk is real, especially for owners and executive leadership. This means early prefab projects require intentional planning, strong partnerships, and realistic expectation. Confidence is built through execution. Execution builds momentum. Prefab adoption is as much about trust as it is about technology. So no pressure. And finally, labor and documentation are the quiet barriers. The industry talks frequently about BIM, digital workflows, and modular assemblies. But Emily highlighted two quieter constraints, labor and documentation. Skilled labor shortages continue to pressure both job site and shop environments. At the same time, we do a poor job documenting lessons learned in prefabrication. Without structured feedback loops, We risk repeating mistakes instead of compounding progress. If prefabrication is going to scale across healthcare, multifamily, and commercial construction, we need better workforce strategies and better knowledge capture. Technology alone will not solve that. Discipline will. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you are interested in learning more, you can visit our sponsor, Great Tech Group, at greattech.com for more information. You can listen to this podcast anytime by simply going to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, be sure to check out our website, bridgingthegappod.com. As always, I'm Todd Weyandt, thanking you for joining the conversation to model the future on the Bridging the Gap podcast. Keep innovating.